We are back here at No Apologies. I am Lori Hids, your host, and with me remoting in this time is an Epoch Times reporter named Nathan Worcester. He is an environmental reporter for the Epoch Times. Nathan, thanks for joining us on No Apologies tonight.
Thank you for having me, Lori.
Well, we're going to talk first about an article that you put out on the 28th of May, and it was titled "Dependence on Foreign Energy, a National Security Problem," says Murkowski challenger Kelly Chewbacca. Now, Kelly is probably spot on this article. Is you know, we in North Dakota all know that it's very important to not be dependent on foreign oil because we're producers of this amazing oil, and the energy production in North Dakota is phenomenal. I appreciate the fact that you wrote this article. Can you tell me a little bit about what else she had to say?
Oh, she was very generous with her time. We spoke for about 50 minutes, primarily about energy, primarily about both Alaska's advantages, its strengths, and some of the real challenges that it has. I should note this was occasioned by the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, which is focused on a whole wide range of options. Natural gas is discussed there, but also nuclear, geothermal, solar, wind, tidal power. And what was very refreshing speaking to her is that I got the sense that her attitude about technology, about energy, is not to say we need to abandon one thing or we need to just only stick with this other thing. It's complementary. The view that you should go with what works, and you should also not sacrifice your advantage based on ideology. That was very striking after speaking with her.
Well, she's a really interesting candidate, too. She's running against Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. That's got to be quite a contentious race, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yes.
And they're opposite. I mean, they are like totally opposite in many ways, but probably also on energy, I would expect.
Well, I think Murkowski is interesting because, like a lot of people, on the establishment side, she gets a lot of money from everybody. She gets a lot of money from even oil and gas. And yet at the same time, I think she has bought into kind of a DC consensus when it comes to some of these issues. My sense from speaking with Kelly was that she was a little more focused on how Alaskans right now are suffering from the incredibly high oil prices and what that means. There are a lot of very isolated rural towns there where diesel is already expensive, even in the best of times. There's one town where it was something like $16 a gallon. And they don't just use diesel. Yep, outrageous. I mean, they don't just use it for trucks either. This is what fuels their generators to be able to remain, alive during some of the worst months of the year. So it's really no joke.
Wow, that is terrible. And you're right, the gas prices all across the nation have everybody's attention right now. So your article probably couldn't have been more timely, at least talking about energy and foreign reliance. Now, one crucial challenge you say in this article in any green transition is potential dependence on China. Can you speak to that? Because we're very aware of the Chinese connection here in North Dakota.
As I would imagine. Yeah, it seems as though whenever you spend more than about 5 minutes really looking into some of these green energy companies, even ones that might be headquartered here in North America, it's often a little too easy to find connections to Chinese state-owned firms. And this is a situation in which I think a lot of your viewers understand that that's not the same as dealing with a company based in the United States or Canada, where there's a clear separation in most cases between the company and the government. Unfortunately, and especially now in recent years, it's very hard to disentangle something like this company, I believe it's called Shenghe Holdings, and its connection to the Chinese government. This is the company that has a stake in MP Materials. MP Materials, which I believe is based in Canada, is the owner of the only rare earth mine in the United States, the only one. And I've spoken with another mining entrepreneur who is understandably a bit upset about the treatment of this company and the treatment of this mine. This mine also received a $35 million grant from the Biden Defense Department for rare earth separation. So, it speaks to, I think, in a lot of ways, naivete that I hope people are starting to wake up from.
Right. Well, we have some quotes that we can show on screen from your article too, and this is Kelly Chewbacca talking about this one too. We should not be subsidizing out things we could be doing in America by benefiting Chinese workers, Chinese dads, and Chinese moms when we are putting Americans out of work. Chewbacca said, noting that Alaska's rare earth reserves are a crucial asset to the United States. She also went on to say as well, when you're dependent on a foreign enemy for an energy solution in the United States, you have created a national security problem. Do you think she's wrong on that?
You know, from all my reporting, I think she's got her finger absolutely on the pulse. When you look at something like rare earth mining, for example, we really do have reserves here that we could tap into in Alaska, elsewhere in the country. We can even use the tailings from those rare earth mines to extract thorium. Now, whether or not that's always going to be economically viable, I'm not 100% certain, but it is a potential option for thorium-based reactors. We really do have not just those assets here, but we have the talent, and we should continue to develop the American talent to move further on up the production process, which is something that China has done very successfully. It's one thing that really struck me when I spoke with potentially Alaska's future senator was the fact that she cited Josh Hawley as someone she really looks forward to working with. And he is someone who I would also say understands these issues. He's someone who understands the importance of America's advantages, based upon our market system, but he also understands the stakes when you're dealing with a country that plays by very different rules.
Absolutely. Josh Hawley from Missouri. Yeah, I follow him too and watch him too. He's a really bright guy. So in particular, oil has historically provided an outsized share of the state's general fund revenue in Alaska, and roughly a quarter of Alaskan jobs and half of its total economy ultimately stem from the oil industry, you say in the article too. So we can totally relate to that here in North Dakota as well.
Yeah, it's one of those issues that it hits home that inevitably, if you end up hollowing out an industry like that is so central to a state, it will have significant effects on the culture. It'll have significant effects on abilities people to be able to provide a living for their families, to live in the place where they've often lived for a long, long time. You know, people, I happen to have the ability to live in a place where my family has lived for more than 150 years. You know, that
Wow.
sort of thing often matters to people. And in the case of Alaska, there is a population decline that has been happening over the past half decade, related in part to the loss of that oil industry. Something else worth noting is that the 30 by 30 initiative from the Biden administration for basically locking away 30% of U.S. federal lands as protected, so very difficult for people to access, a lot of that will affect Alaska. So there is a sentiment that from the perspective maybe of people who are not in Alaska, it would be a good thing if people left that state, and that's something that it's worth hearing that, and it's worth considering whether there's something to that.
Welcome back to No Apologies. With me, joining me remotely is Nathan Worcester, who is an environmental reporter for the Epoch Times. And we always love having Epoch Times reporters here, but you guys have the greatest articles and excellent information. And I am a subscriber, so I can see all the really cool stuff that you have too. I saw an article, Nathan, that you did on the 24th of May, and it was titled 2020 Homicide Spike Unrelated to COVID-19 or Gun Sales Weaker in GOP Counties, according to a report. And so that piqued my interest, first of all. In it, you say that new research has found that the 2020 homicide surge was weaker in Republican states and voting counties, I guess, not linked to gun sales increases or COVID-19. And it was interesting that these things are all interconnected in here. So tell me a little bit about your thought process in putting this article out.
Well, you know, one interesting thing is that there has been a lot of coverage of a different report, which was put out by a group called the Third Way Foundation. They're on the left, center left, but they were arguing that the homicide spike in 2020, which I think we all pretty well remember, was a bigger problem in red states. So, you know, they have a 10-page report, and they argue, oh, you know, there's a higher rate of increase of homicides associated with guns I think they have South Dakota at the very top, various other states underneath. And, anytime you're looking at a problem in detail, you want to use the tool that can allow you to look at it most closely. If you're trying to understand something very small, you want to use a microscope. You don't want to just use a magnifying glass. And so this is a case where I think just about anybody who didn't have a partisan axe to grind would say, let's look at this in more detail. And sure enough, this Manhattan Institute report, along with a lot of other research, looked at the county level trends, looked at things that you might be able to associate with, say, a particular district attorney, whether or not they were, backed by a particular billionaire's money, for example. Yes.
Gotcha.
Well, the Manhattan Institute did not include Soros DA as a dummy variable in their study, but I mean, the point is that contrary to a lot of the media narrative out there, there was no connection with COVID-19 in this study, which is something that a lot of people have asserted. They said this violence in 2020, people were just cooped up under the lockdowns. They were angry and they broke out in violence. Maybe there's something to that, but that's not what this suggests. And the attempt to link it to GOP voting or GOP leadership, when it comes to things like crime, local leadership matters a whole lot more than whoever's running the state, as I think anybody on any side of the aisle who's being honest about it would tell you. It comes down to who's the sheriff, who's the DA, who's the judge, all that sort of stuff.
Well, this breaking down the 2020 homicide spike, this was from the Manhattan Institute, as you said, and it said in 2020, amid the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic and the protests and riots surrounding the death of George Floyd, America's homicide rate increased by an astonishing 30%, even as many less serious types of crime held steady or even declined. The purpose of this brief, it says, is to describe the people and the places most affected by the explosion of lethal violence, using data on homicides from hundreds of the nation's largest counties, as you say, the smaller versions. We analyze various demographic characteristics of victims as well as the geographic correlates of the spike in violence. And what they found is so absolutely opposite. Let's show, first of all, the screenshot of the other group. This is Third Way that you talked about, too. This shows the red state murder problem. And look at those states there. Now, I'm sorry if I'm giggling, Nathan, but it just does not seem truthful to me at all. No,
it kind of beggars belief, doesn't it? I mean,
it kind of does.
I've spent a lot of time in cities that were visibly changed after 2020. Downtown Chicago, near where I live, has been visibly changed.
Yep.
But
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis, St. Paul. The list goes on. Portland, Oregon, if you look at its murder statistics and how they've changed. But somehow we're supposed to buy that, okay, if you find a way to slice up the data in such a way that it doesn't seem to correspond to people's experience of the past few years, then that's the explanation for what's happened. I'm sorry, I don't really buy it.
Well, your report is fantastic, as always. I always love reading the Epoch Times, too. The authors found that homicides were far less common in counties with a higher Republican share of the vote in 2016. What's more, the homicide growth rate between 2019 and 2020 was also lower in those counties.
Yes, and I should caution that analysis was somewhat more tentative, the linkage with GOP voting counties, but that's a lot more honest, I would say, to say that this is a tentative link than to say it's a red state murder problem, which is the other report, what they're claiming.
A little inflammatory in that Third Way report there, too. That they're going for a narrative there, obviously.
Definitely. And, I'll note that John Lott was kind enough to speak with me. I don't know if your readers are familiar with him. He, in addition to serving in the Trump administration, he is one of the nation's top scholars on firearms violence. And, one point that he made is that the Manhattan Institute report was somewhat unusual in that it relied upon CDC data. So normally,
Okay, that's enough said.
Well, we don't have to make the joke, but I was going to say that usually what they do is they compare what's known as the FBI uniform crime reports, which are based upon information provided by local police departments and sheriffs It's not total coverage, but it's pretty comprehensive. They compare that with what's known as the National Victimization Survey. And that survey, and this is just, I'm kind of geeking out on this because it's like, if you want to understand the problem, you want to try to make sure you're
Drill
correcting.
down. Yep.
So what the victimization survey does is it basically surveys people in a pretty standardized way to make sure that there's no big discrepancy between what people are reporting and what people are actually experiencing on the ground. Because like if people had suddenly stopped going to the police as much, which you might think that might have been a thing, then maybe the victimization survey would look a lot different from the other FBI data, but it doesn't. And something that Mr. Lott pointed out to me is that between 2019 and 2020, there was actually a precipitous drop in, I believe it was homicides caused by firearms. Let me just double check to make absolutely sure. But that again runs totally contrary to the narrative when it comes to guns and violence in 2020.
The other interesting thing that you have in here too is the Soros connection too. You said DAs funded by left-wing billionaire George Soros, including Kim Foxx in Chicago and Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, have been faulted by opponents for rising rates of property crime and violent crime, along with others. Some great information in here. I really appreciate you coming on and spelling it out for us. And be sure to read Nathan Worcester's articles in the Epoch Times, viewers, because he's got some great stuff there. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you, absolutely. And I'll just plug my Twitter and my Truth Social accounts. Smart. I'm NN Worcester on Twitter and Nathan Worcester on Truth Social if you want to follow me on social media.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the information and being on tonight.